All right, welcome to another podcast for Alberta Enterprise Group. I am the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group, Danielle Smith, and this is such an exciting topic for me because it took me many years to understand the construction industry and the different types of shops that there are, what CLAC even is, and also to understand a little bit more about some of the shortages that we might face in the future when it comes to skilled trades. When I talk to our members, what I'm hearing is that we're looking at potentially 3 years from now where we're going to end up with some serious problems. And the question is, do we have the pipeline of young people coming through in order to fill that gap? One of our board members, Terry O'Flynn, was on the Skills for Jobs Task Force. And one of the things they found was that the average age for a person getting into the apprenticeship program is about 27 years old. So think about that for a bit. If you can imagine somebody graduating from high school who wants to be on a trades track, not actually finding out that's what they want to do until they're 27 years old. Is there a way for us to be able to shorten that time frame? Lots of great work has been done around the world in looking at ways to connect young people with great careers in the skilled trades. And we're going to talk with Paul DeYoung a little bit more about what we ought to do around that. As you know, I've been very interested in creating a trades charter school. And so I'll give you a bit of an update on where that's at, and we can see if we can find a pathway forward. Maybe that is the only thing to do, is to have an industry-led approach to make sure that kids are getting introduced to the trades earlier. So joining me now to talk about all of this is Paul DeYoung. He is the president of the Progressive Contractors Association. Did I say that right? Progressive Contractors Association.
Correct.
Okay, perfect. Because I think that there's a lot of folks who, just like me, didn't realize that there are different ways in which the construction industry gets organized. And so I think we probably just need to get an overview of where the construction industry is, what makes your shop different than the building trades, what makes the building trades and you different from an open shop. But I think we all share the same issues, is whether you're open shop, whether you're building trades, or whether you're a CLAC organized workplace. We are going to need a pipeline of young people coming through, interested in all the great jobs that are available in the skilled profession. So let's begin first by talking a bit about who you represent. Who are your members?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on this podcast, Danielle. It's an exciting opportunity to cast a light on an important part of our industry. The construction industry in general has got about 1.5 million workers in Canada, significant contributor to GDP, a significant employer of workers of all ages. And as you mentioned, we have some challenges. One of them is the workforce renewal subject. We have a lot of workers in the industry who are aging and need to be replaced by youth and folks from jurisdictions that haven't previously showed up too much in our industry. Our industry is hungry for innovation and is hungry for investment. So we'll get to some of those themes, but let me answer your question about who is Progressive Contractors Association and what does this look like in terms of a variety of labor models. Going back about 20 or 30 years, the Canadian construction industry was very much a polarized industry. You had on the one side of the industry the craft unions, the building trade unions, and the contractors they were signatory to. On the other side of the industry, you had the non-union sector, which is a fairly large, amorphous sector, commonly also understood as the merit or open shop sector. And so on one side, the open shop was characterized by a kind of a free enterprise, the employer decides mentality. The other side was very much where the unions were exerting their collective bargaining power to restrict and manage the affairs of the employer in a way that eventually began to cause a kind of a drag on the industry. If you looked at a place like Fort McMurray, it was primarily a union area, the oil sands. And as you got into the late 1990s, the major owner companies, although they appreciated the work that the building trade workers had done, were getting frustrated with the kind of the one-stop shop nature of it all. There was really no competition between contractors. There was no competition between unions because there was only one form of union in town. And as a result, there was kind of a stalemate that happened. not a lot of dynamic change. The wage rates were getting higher than the market really needed to have. Productivity was low. A number of good things were happening, like training, but there was a number of key things that were not coming into play. The non-union sector didn't really have the training and the focus of skilled workers that the building trades did. And so you had this really bifurcated industry. If you were a politician, a policymaker, you had to somehow pick and choose which of those models you were going to pay attention to. And they were miles apart. Not a lot of migration between the two when it came to workers. You didn't see a lot of non-union workers working for a little bit on the building trade side or vice versa. In fact, building trade union members got fined if they worked in the non-union sector. They're very much held in their respective tracks. In the late 1990s, a fascinating change began to happen, and that was you mentioned the union CLAC, and CLAC is a union that we have dealt with as a group of contractors. I represent about 125 construction companies, ranging from some of Canada's largest general and trade contractors all the way down to small family-run companies. And the distinguishing element of my membership is that we have the free enterprise mentality that the open shop has, but we're unionized. Our contractors at PCA are unionized primarily by the CLAC union. And we have decided a number of key things. Number one, rather than take the traditional approach of resisting that union relationship and trying to kind of tuck it into a corner or put it on a shelf for the 2 or 3 years between collective bargaining cycles, we lean into it. We actually say as contractors, here's a union that is part of our life. It's part of our corporate life. It's part of our workers' life. What are we going to do with that strategically and tactically to either drive our business forward and or communicate to the broader stakeholders, owners, investors, that there's something different here that's worthy of investment.
Paul, let me pause you for a minute, because there's a few things that you've said so far before we continue on.
Sure.
I stuttered when I opened up because I knew you had another acronym or another initial in your name, and it is Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. So you're not just in Alberta, correct? You say you have 125 member companies.
Yes.
Are you facing these similar problems outside of the oil sands? We'll talk more about the oil sands, but I just want to understand how broad the issue is.
Yeah, that's a good clarifying point. PCA kind of grew up in the heavy industrial sector, the oil sands. Many of our companies in the late 1990s found themselves on the cusp of doing tremendous amounts of work there, but the owners didn't quite understand that sort of alternative labor model. And so PCA was formed to represent those contractors, to break down some legislative barriers, to talk to the owner companies about the newness, the novelty, the power of this alternative model. And we branched out from there. We're now in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario. Quebec is a different labor jurisdiction, and so they have a kind of a pre-baked approach to labor and contracting. And then the East Coast has been an area that we're looking at, because we think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there, at least on paper. Economically, a bit of a depressed region. And so we focused our energies in kind of central and Western Canada for the past 20 years.
Okay. So let's then go back and talk about this world that changed in the late 1990s, because it wasn't an easy world to change either, because I seem to recall there being quite a bit of friction between the different types of workplaces. Maybe we've gotten over that, but I know you're going to tell us. So tell us how it evolved in the late 90s.
Well, again, I was talking about this kind of polarized approach or reality in the industry. Typically, the non-union sector was doing commercial construction and residential, that kind of thing. And the heavy industrial construction and large infrastructure work was being done by these building trade signatory contractors and unions. So again, a really kind of a polarized industry. Politicians were trying to pick kind of winners and losers. Owner companies were trying to find some dynamic tension that could help create some helpful cost sensitivity and more workers, because the oil sands were about to explode in terms of activity, and they were worried that they wouldn't have enough workers in terms of number and skill to do the work. Along came our contractors, who were increasingly demonstrating massive capability on large projects in Grand Prairie and Cold Lake and in other jurisdictions in Ontario and British Columbia. But the oil sands said, we don't quite understand how this works. And so my organization went in and sort of demystified to the owner firms When I say owner, I mean the Suncors and the Syncrudes and eventually the CNRLs and the OptiNexans and so on, and help them to understand that there's, instead of two pillars in construction, there's really actually three. And in fact, there's a spectrum. There's, on the one side of the equation, the traditional craft unions that organize work on separate jurisdictional lines of electrical, carpentry. There's about 17 different trades that the building trades cover. And on the other side of the spectrum is this kind of more loosely organized non-union sector. But between that was a tremendous amount of experimentation or innovation accomplished by my member companies with the union CLAC to explore new ways of maintaining a free enterprise sensitivity, but also recognizing that the union has a place to collectively bargain on behalf of those workers. And we do have some structures that have to be recognized. And in fact, not only have to recognize them, but can actually be drivers of business. And so this third pillar
So I
grew up
think,
in Canada.
well, and I do want to understand how the third pillar grew, but maybe you can tell me, and maybe I'll have to interview the head of CLAC to understand a little bit more about them. But before you could have them in your workplace, they had to exist in the first place. Who are they? Where did they come from? What's the history there?
Well, because of our multi-decade affiliation with CLAC, I know their story well. Back in the 50s, a group of folks came in primarily from Europe with a different way of understanding how unions work, rather than unions being attached to a specific trade or occupation. In Europe, the mentality is that a union represents a whole bunch of folks based on their kind of outlook on life. There might be a Marxist trade union, there might be a Catholic trade union, and a variety of different trade unions to resemble the outlooks that the workers have in life. And there might be more than one union in a workplace in Europe. These people came to Europe to Canada as immigrants, and the States, and made a provocative proposal that the European model of trade unionism should be replicated in Canada in some fashion. And that's where CLAC was started, taking key values about the respect of the worker, the respect of the work itself, that the management and union or employees do not have to be in an adversarial struggle, that the workplace is some kind of battleground. But in fact, the CLAC model, as I understand it, is that the workplace is a place to solve problems and to work together to strengthen the business enterprise. And that's why we as a group of contractors have kind of looked into that model and said, well, we shouldn't resist this. We should embrace it. They have a role to play as a union. We have a role to play as management, but together we can demonstrate to the broader marketplace, whether again, that's owner companies, construction, buyers of construction, politicians, and even groups like Indigenous people and increasingly today, organizations like Women Building Future, demonstrate to them that there's a whole bunch of options in this marketplace. There's not just two. There's a series of options in terms of who wants to get involved, how they want to get involved, how they want to be represented, and how that investment money will flow to a much more robust and fit industry than it was before.
It's such an interesting concept. I wonder how it's modernized, because I think it stands for Christian Labor Association of Canada, right? But is it organized around Christian principles, or is that just?
Now you'll have to get the director of CLAC to unpack that stuff with you. Our understanding is that there are indeed some sort of general principles that CLAC has adopted, and that it's not a religious organization, but simply is being quite transparent about the principles that all organizations have, whether they recognize it or not. And they're saying these are the things that drive what we do or what they do as a union. And so again, I mentioned a few of those. One of them is collaboration instead of adversarialism. That respect of the work also comes with respect of the worker. And those are principles that I think are very accessible, not just to many workers, and CLAC has shown it by growing dramatically over the past 20 years, but also that it's relevant to contractors who also feel very strongly about respecting the workers, of having a safe and productive and meaningful workplace where workers can progress along a career, and that broader stakeholders like government and other groups will see this industry to be one that encompasses the kind of things that we care about today. Later on, I think we're going to talk about things like environment and social, procurement and governance. Those are things that are kind of almost anticipated by our model. We recognize that the new way of doing business in Canada is to have a collaboration between the various stakeholders in the construction market, that we have to be respectful of the environment, that we have to have modern governance structures. And so a lot of these things are things that we've anticipated with CLAC at PCA.
It's so fascinating. So what was the breakthrough then in oil sands? So tell me how that all unfolded when you made the case to the companies that you mentioned, Nexen, CNRL, Suncor. How did that transition then end up working?
There were really two primary levers or motivators that happened in the early 2000s. One of them was Suncor, who was embarking on some additional components of work. And we're getting frustrated with, as I described earlier, the relative lack of dynamic tension that was presented by the building trades. It was all kind of baked in together. There were continued worries about the adversarial nature of the representation on the job site, the threats or possibilities of strikes and lockouts. And I can't speak for Suncor, but my understanding is that they wanted to have a bit more competition in the marketplace. Like, how can we bring more contractors in to provide skill, but also skilled workers? And so Suncor, and then soon after that CNRL, which kind of showed up with what we call a greenfield project, which was Horizon. And greenfield is just a descriptor of a brand new project, kind of starting fresh. And those two projects in the early 2000s were both begging of a larger workforce, more creativity when it came to how the workforce was managed, and more skill when it came to who was performing the construction. And our companies said, we've got solutions for you, Suncor and CNRL. We have a union relationship, so it checks off the box of labor rest and economic certainty on the project. Building trade contractors who have skill in this area and have shown that over the years. But we're going to add more. We're going to add more competition, more possibilities to the owners to get the best in the room. And our companies, shown by history, were able to demonstrate not just to Suncor and to CNRL, but all the subsequent players that came into town, like Meg Energy and OptiNexen and Shell and Imperial Oil, that we could build huge projects with a population of workers represented by CLAC, and the tremendous skill that our contractors provided, and a more collaborative approach, not just between union and workers, but also saying to the clients, let us get into this project early with you. Let's have some early engagement with you to talk about constructability and value engineering, and try to help you understand at the outset what some of the construction problems are going to be, so that we can save money, save on time, and increase the level of certainty and lower the degree of risk. And it has been phenomenally successful, not just in Fort McMurray, but across the country. If I may say so, we have transformed how construction was done.
Well, it's so interesting because I feel like I was in on the ground floor, because I started writing at the Calgary Herald in 1999. And so I guess as you're making this transformation and growth, I've kind of always known about you, but I haven't had a chance to talk to you about the history. So it's fascinating to have watched it unfold. So give me an idea. When you say it's grown dramatically, is there some way of quantifying that? Like how many member companies you had, or how many workers that were employed by member companies back in 2000 versus today? What can you tell us about the growth?
Well, PCA was founded in the year 2000 with a half a dozen companies who found themselves equally signatory to CLAC. We're trying to kind of figure out what that relationship meant, because it was still quite new to them. And they were saying, how can we work together to improve not just that labor partnership with CLAC, but also represent that in ways that politicians, decision makers, and bureaucrats will understand, so that labor laws can be modernized, apprenticeship regulations can be modernized, but also that the owners will understand the power of this model. And these companies formed PCA 20 years ago, these 6 companies. And because of the strength of that model and the value of that community of contractors, even though they compete with each other, they said, we're not really non-union contractors anymore. We're not building trade contractors. We're something else. And what is that? Well, that's the progressive contractors. And so one by one, and sometimes more than one by one, sometimes by large numbers, our association grew year over year to the fact that we now have about 120 companies. And again, trying to answer your question, I'm going to use the oil sands as an example, but there's many other jurisdictions. If you looked at the oil sands in the mid or late 1990s, 95% of the work was being done by contractors signatory to the building trades. And if a PCA member company tried to get in, it was very, very difficult. In fact, it was a threatening atmosphere. There were verbal and physical threats that were delivered. Tires were slashed, threats were made, that kind of stuff. It was a very kind of almost a cartoon-like depiction of the union as the thug, which is unfortunate because I have friends in the building trade movement that I've gotten to know professionally over the years, and they really, in many ways, are trying to do a good job. But unfortunately, because of a lack of competition and a lack of new ideas coming into the sector, it tended to get kind of ossified and kind of closed-minded. And so that 95% kind of market dominance in, I'm going to say 1999, changed by 10 years later to about 50-50. About 50% of the work in Rising was being done by PCA members with this CLAC model. And in fact, is not just on the construction side, which we call CapEx, capital expenditures, but now is increasingly taking over on the OpEx side, which is the maintenance, long-term maintenance, shutdowns and turnarounds. Because again, the lessons that were learned on the construction side are translatable to the maintenance side. And so, you know, it's been an incredible time of change for the industry. What we now have on these projects, again, not just in the oil sands, but on BC Hydro's Site C, in Saskatchewan on major potash plants, on different projects across the country, is what we call an open managed site, where the owner says, we're going to take everybody, all contractors who are fit to do the work, whether they're building trade signatory, CLAC signatory, or non-union, and we are going to ask them to present to us the best package of construction delivery possible so that the owner can pick and choose the contractors who have the best fitness and have the best workforce. And what you'll typically see increasingly is a representation of all of these. You'll have non-union companies performing work on these major projects, PCA member companies, building trade signatory companies, and the workers. And everybody gets to have a choice, and the workers get to have a choice. They can choose if they want to work under one model or another, based on the conditions that are presented. You know, the financial positions. You know, what kind of pay packages are being presented. What kind of career opportunities are the contractors presenting? And so it creates not just a fascinating, but a powerful competition, so that not only are workers being given choices, but investors are being given choices. Okay, you now can have an investor say, now I've got an industry that's got competition, and this is where I want to put my money, because it's not this sort of, you know, monopoly where my money is going to basically, you know, turn into a 50% value of what I had at the start.
It's such a fascinating model because I guess because I came up through the conservative movement, there was often a discussion of right to work legislation, and it was sort of presented in a binary way where either you're a member of a union or you opt out. And the argument was always, well, if you're going to be on a particular job site, you have to have everybody under the same umbrella. And so this is what I'm trying to figure out. So I know that there are companies that contract with all three types. So the merit contractors are the open shop guys, and then your guys for the progressive contractors, and then also building trades. But are you saying that on some of the large projects, everybody takes a piece of that? So you'll have all three of those types of operations on the same site, or is it site specific? The building trades gets one, merit contractors get one, you get another.
No, you'll have a large project X in northern Alberta, which might be $1 or $2 billion, and the project will be broken down into what they call silos or portions. And one silo might be performed primarily by building trade contractors. Another silo might be performed by PCA contractors signatory to CLAC. And other work might be performed by merit contractors or other blending characteristics within. The silo approach has been done in the past to reduce the level of tensions that might exist between those different labor models, because they are real. Historically, they were very tense. They are much less tense today than they were 20 years ago. It used to be a concerning thing for a CLAC member to walk into a bar in Fort McMurray in the year 2005. Whereas today, it's just like it's sort of like sports teams. There's affiliations and preferences, and certain folks think that their union is the best, and other folks think that their union is better, and other folks still who feel that they are the best because they haven't chosen the union and they can be their own agent, representing for their own person with a contractor. And so I think I look at that and I see a healthy industry. There's choice for workers. There's competition between contractors. There's a lot of opportunities because when you have competition, you grow the pie. And I've said this over and over again to my friends in industry, but also those who might pose as my enemies. Let's duke this out, on the floor, but let's first land the investment dollars. Let's get that LNG sector landed in BC and taking off. Let's get the oil sands rehabilitated so that investors will see it once again as a promising opportunity. But for heaven's sake, let's not characterize this industry as pathological at the outset so that investors say, well, why would I put my money there? It's just not a very good destination. And so,
okay, so no one likes to lose market share, regardless of whether you've got a sort of a business owner's hat on or a union leader's hat on. And so, are they getting enough business that they feel like that we've got a détente between the three different groups, or like how should we interpret that? Because you said you guys keep on growing.
Yeah, well, I again won't presume to speak for the building trades or their umbrella organizations, but I would imagine that they're feeling the pinch. What they had as a monopoly 20 years ago has absolutely changed. And CLAC is feeling the pinch because the dynamic change or the evolution has not just stopped with the migration from building trades to CLAC. It continues on where non-union companies show a tremendous amount of capability, where they have training programs, health and welfare programs, safety programs that mimic the structures that have been put in place by unions like CLAC or the building trades. And so what it does is it forces unions, I'm saying generically unions, to constantly innovate and get better at what they do to prove value to their members and to the contractors they are signatory to. And the compelling bell ringing in the background is, if you don't innovate, you're probably going to not make it. And that's a little scary, but welcome to the contracting world. Every single contractor in Canada knows if they don't prove their fitness every single day of the week to their prospective clients, they're not going to make it in the marketplace. And so we as contractors say to the unions, get used to it. This innovation thing is here to stay. It's a good thing. It drives better outcomes. And don't kind of get your feet stuck in the ground, because that's no way to grow.
I love what you're talking about here. Now, here's the question. We have lots of big multi-billion-dollar projects in construction for infrastructure and government procurement. So does this same type of siloed approach, where all three different types of contractors can participate on a road building project for the government or a hospital or a school, does that exist as well?
To some degree, yes. The public sector, the infrastructure sector, is a little bit different because let me be careful how I say this, the municipality or the province who owns that particular project, a hospital, a highway, a bridge, doesn't necessarily view the project in the same way as a private owner might, and compel themselves as a private owner might to have a very robust costing structure. I don't want to accuse municipalities of being soft on the pricing of their projects, but that's not, in our experience, necessarily the driving issue. It's a mixture of cost, but also executional value in the public sector. And so you may not always get low bid as the commanding concept in the public sector. It should be, and it often is, but it's not always. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Increasingly across Canada, a phenomenon called community benefit agreements has cropped up, where for a public project, again, it's provincial or municipal or city, a project is built, and at first blush, there is a very, I think, a helpful notion that comes in, which says, well, if you're going to build this project in my backyard, I want to make sure I get some benefits from it. So maybe the local workforce, local businesses might have a bit more of an access to that project than they might have done before.
I must tell you, on that point, I hear about that an awful lot. There is a measure of frustration among frontline workers if they feel like companies are hiring in from outside. And I don't know how to balance that, because we do want to, as taxpayers, we do want to get the best price. But you know what? I also want local employment. So what do you think ought to happen there?
So what governments have been doing for years, and of course people don't know about this because the procurement process is fairly obscure, only contractors really understand it, is that the municipality or the province will ask a contractor who's bidding, show me your labor plan. Are you going to hire locally? If so, how are you going to do that? Are you going to have targets? Are you going to have aspirations? And what they're trying to tease out is the contractor's commitment to strengthening the local economy and the local workforce. And many contractors will say, well, absolutely, I'll do that. I need more workers. I want to have local businesses because my costs will be more effective if I hire a local contractor than one across the country. So that's a very simple way. We call it baking in community expectations into procurement. We just bake it in there. It's a very easy thing to do. The community benefit agreement goes a fair degree further than that, and it creates a sort of a superstructure around the project, which it invites other stakeholders to participate in. So that might be unions, it might be environmental groups, it might be local nonprofits, to say, hey, let's get you all in here to see who wants to put their finger on this pie. And that's where a problem arises. When you have equity-seeking groups who aren't integral to the project, contractors, suppliers, the owner, and to some degree the unions if they're signatory to the contractor, you have the possibility of rent seeking, where an organization may say, well, I'm going to take part in this, but I want to have a little bit of extra kick in there for me. The worst example of that is in British Columbia, where the NDP government has kind of worked exclusively with the BC building trade unions to stipulate that all major projects, things like the Portillo Bridge, $1.4 billion, the Broadway LRT, $2.4 billion, will only be done by building trade workers. You can be a non-union contractor working on that, but you have to have your workforce be comprised of building trade union members. And so going back to your question, we don't have the same type of dynamic tension that we've seen in the private sector, where owners have said to the marketplace, show me your best options, whether you're union or CLAC or non-union, and let's see who the best will. And often what will happen because of needs of workforce supply and contractor expertise is you'll see a spectrum of value offering on a large project in the private sector. In the public sector, governments will potentially cave into these special interest groups and say, well, you're promising me a large workforce and you're promising me that you're going to have more women and more Indigenous people. We'll give this whole workforce thing to you, group of unions. And that's what's happened in jurisdictions like Ottawa with a hospital that's being built there. The Hamilton LRT, which is a new project being conceived with this project in BC that I've mentioned. And so we see these examples popping up in the marketplace where governments don't really understand how to take or leverage what our construction industry is offering, which is competition, worker choice, and value that comes through that. Instead, they're sort of saying, well, in order to achieve some vague outcomes, we're going to allow special interest groups to kind of pre-bake that cake. And the end result is more cost for the taxpayer, fewer choices for workers and contractors who are left with a much leaner innovation bag than they have used before.
It's important that you raise that, because we're right in the middle of municipal elections in Alberta. And I was just speaking with somebody in the last day or so about how a union political action committee has $3 million to back candidates. And I don't know if this community benefits agreement is kind of part and parcel of what it is that they're expecting of the candidates that they endorse, that if you get elected, when you have to approve projects, you're going to have to put these rigidities around that. But have we seen it emerge in Alberta yet?
Thankfully, no. We know that in the NDP Notley administration, there was a test project run. I think it was a hospital in Pinoca, where a community benefit agreement was tested. But we advocated strongly to the NDP government at that time that they should avoid making the mistake that was made in other jurisdictions, which was, by all means, create some goals of hiring locally, employing local businesses, hire more Indigenous people, and get more women involved and more youth. But don't create a kind of a white elephant structure by which to attain those goals, because contractors will do that anyways. All you have to do is ask them, because they want to have more workers, as we've talked about earlier. And so we successfully pitched the NDP party at the time, or the government at the time, to do a community benefit agreement, but don't add all those extra punitive and controlling components. And they did that, and that's the only time that we've seen it, in my experience in Alberta.
Okay, well, that's good to know. I think it's probably good for us to transition to talking about ESG because we spend a lot of time talking about environmental aspects. I haven't spent as much time talking about social aspects and governance aspects. And the whole notion behind ESG investing is that there's a lens that investors will run a company through to make sure that they tick off a bunch of boxes. And I'm wondering how that is impacting your model, because you talked earlier about how your model kind of already addresses those issues and brings it to the table from a front end point of view. But I suppose now that you've mentioned this community benefits agreement, it is possible that investors could say, okay, there's only one type of business model we'll support to be able to meet our social goals, or one type of community benefits agreements. And so you said that hasn't happened in Alberta among our politicians, but are we seeing that among investors? Are investors saying, as a condition of backing this project, you have to hire this particular set of unions or exclude others?
Yeah, I'll try to answer the question on two tracks. One of them is the investment impulse. We do see, and this is early days, we do see the rise of different institutional investment organizations using ESG as a framework to insist that a project have certain outcomes. And if you're sticking to the S in the ESG, the social, that might be that a union or group of unions be recognized as kind of owning the S, representing that the workers will be treated fairly and paid fairly and safely. And again, those are good outcomes, good goals, but the vehicle is pre-chosen or could be pre-chosen. One of the biggest examples, and we haven't had a chance to really dig into it yet, is in Hamilton. I mentioned the Hamilton LRT project. A large investment organization called Fengate has taken an equity position in that project. That's fine, it's done all the time. Fengate has taken many equity positions, and there's nothing wrong with that. Fengate, however, is closely tied to LIUNA, which is the Labor International Union of North America, with, I think, hundreds of thousands of members. It's their pension plan. And so we are looking closely at these type of funding structures to determine if those union affiliated pension plans are trying to not only take an equity position, but use that to stipulate or somehow create an end result that the workforce is only a building trades union workforce.
Oh, interesting.
Again, this is early days. We don't know exactly where this is happening, but we see the beginnings of it because the connections are there. We know that in the Hamilton LRT situation, our contractors are not able to bid with their CLAC affiliation. So we see this early warning sign that these barricades are being put up because of institutional investor requirements or rules. So that's
isn't that interesting? Because as you point that out, I mean, there are I wouldn't even know how much of total asset value that is managed by public sector unions, but it's pretty significant. I know that there's a divestment movement against fossil fuels where they claim that a $14.5 trillion worth of assets has been moved away from fossil fuel investment. I hadn't considered that there might be this other layer that with that same kind of market power, they can start moving it over into dictating terms on a variety of different infrastructure projects. Yeah. So you're saying that the first sort of hint of that is this project in Hamilton that we should be keeping an eye on? Yeah.
So that's the institutional investment side. The other track or the other train of thought is corporations, and I'll keep that word generic for the time being, who are owners of a project or want to be owners of a project may now, with the ESG reality, which is really just an evolution of what we used to know as a social responsibility or corporate social responsibility. It's evolved into ESG to trap more elements than just the social part. It's got the E now for environment and the G for governance. And we're relatively neutral on this concept. ESG is still relatively greenfield. It's only been around for about 5 years. There's about 5 or 6 international models that are kind of going through their evolutions and being adopted variously by different parties. But one of the concerns that we have is, as much as it makes sense for companies to think through their environmental impact, their social impact, their governance approach, is what I mentioned earlier, which is who are they inviting to that party? Are they sort of saying, well, we don't really know how to manage the S in social, so who's going to help us with that? Well, that's where you have the possibility of, on the government side, regulatory capture, and in the private sector, just rent seeking, where organizations will say, we'll perform that S for you, but you've got to abide by our rules. And that's where I gave the potent example of the in British Columbia. But even private in corporations are now starting to say, well, in order to avoid future damage to our institutional reputation, let's sort of get some people involved to help us unpack the E and the S and the G. And if that goes well, that's good for the marketplace and it's good for the corporation. But we're at present unconvinced that that's going to work as smoothly as some people think. There are many incidences where it's going offside. So it's something that we're analyzing. We're in the middle of a big project right now with one of the think tanks in Canada called Contractors, specifically to understand how community benefit agreements are being executed in the marketplace. What are the costs? What are the benefits? What are the pitfalls? But more broadly, we're looking at this whole ESG thing to understand what does that layer, that filter mean for the construction sector.
No, it's really interesting because it strikes me that what we have to do is make sure that we maintain competition.
Yeah.
What I like about what you've said about the dynamism that happens between the three different types of workplaces is each one is holding each other accountable to continue to push up on the standards. And that's the perfect world that you want. That's why I love competition. I love free enterprise because it's that competition element that I think is so important. So I'm trying to think through, I think you've got that nailed on the S part in construction, if you can just make that case on these community benefits agreements. Have you thought through how that applies on the environmental side of things? I almost feel like there isn't that same kind of dynamic balance, that there's kind of a uniform approach on environmental issues. And I wonder if there's any flags that you've seen on that, or is that just a little bit too far outside your wheelhouse?
Yeah, I mean, the E for environment begins to move outside of the lane at PCI. We're very focused on labor issues and workforce issues. Obviously, as contractors, we are building significant internal capacity to deal with the increasing level of requirement to meet environmental objectives that owners might place before us, and that's fine. All I can say, again, somewhat generically, is that the E is like the S. It's probably a good thing for the marketplace to think about. But what happens when there's distortion? And I think there's two things to say there. If anybody has listened to Milton Friedman, he has always advocated, or did advocate, that the corporation is no place for social causes. And that doesn't mean that you are heartless. It means that there are other intermediate institutions in society that can care for that. And unions are one of them. And so I think, again, getting away from this binary idea that unions are bad, or flipping it around, corporations are bad. Everybody has a role to play. And I think that if we do this right, we can accomplish great things when it comes to the E and the S and the G.
I think you're right.
If we do it wrong, there'll be tremendously costly, both socially, to families and communities, but also financially, if we do it wrong, because it's going to get out of control.
Well, you've planted a seed with me, because there's so many companies that are associated with Alberta Enterprise Group that are environmental companies because they're doing well site cleanup, or they've come up with some great new bacteria that eats hydrocarbons, or they've come up with some fabulous new way of being able to grow forests, spruce and pine trees in order to do replanting. So maybe that's how we broaden out the E discussion. It's not just Greenpeace we go to, but it's all these great innovators on the environment who are putting forward environmental solutions. Okay, you planted a seed there. Maybe you'll plant a seed on governance, because I've never really fully understood what the G is supposed to mean. I'll tell you what I think it means. Because I did a number of segments on this when I used to do radio. Is there seems to be a real push to get a diversity quotient built into the construction of boards of directors that oversee corporations. So the first big push was on, are there enough women in those oversight positions? But maybe there's more to it than that. Are you able to shed some light on the kind of things that you're looking at for G, or again, is that kind of outside your lane?
Yeah, it's mostly outside our lane. I mean, governance, again, is not a brand new concept. I mean, there's a whole industry around increasing the fitness of corporations' governance capabilities. And in general, we support that. I'm familiar with some governance models like Carver, which helps organizations to become more sophisticated around the business focusing on the goal, on the ends, and the board of directors focusing on the means. If that's what the G in governance is all about, bring it on. Let's have better run companies that can demonstrate to their stakeholders or shareholders that they're being run in ways that are transparent and fit and reliable. I have less enthusiasm when the governance structures are invaded by social elements. Again, I don't think you can sort of preclude that, but if you're beginning to migrate away from running companies profitably and well, so that there are job creation and results for investors, instead of you're focusing on other things. I'll give you an analogy, and I'll switch it to a different group. Like, so unions, for example, because we deal with so many unions or in that sector, the historical and I think undeniable raison d'etre of a union is to bargain for the workers, ensure that they're being paid and treated well and safely. That's a pretty simple description, but I think a fair one. Increasingly, what we see today, fortunately, our labor partner CLAC does not do this, is that unions will delve into all sorts of non-collective bargaining issues. And I'm not going to say that that's categorically wrong. Going back to the corporation, it's not categorically wrong for the corporation to have as a board of governors or directors discussions about social issues. But those can easily become the goal rather than one of the things that you're addressing along the way. And so I look at these things, whether it's in the corporation or the unions, and they say, stay in your lane. You're here to run a business, and you're here to generate returns for your investors and to employ people. Do that and work with other folks who are interested in representing workers, increasing environmental stewardship, et cetera. Don't try to water down your governance structure to do too many things.
You've given us lots to think about, and I'm wondering what where we should be watching on this. Because as you're talking, I'm thinking, Mark Carney. I think he's sort of the creator of this whole ESG concept, either the creator or the person who's certainly advanced it. But then we've also seen Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum talking about stakeholder capitalism, and I'm wondering if there's some flags there that we should be watching, or are those are the models that they're proposing? Are there some benefits to them? What have you looked closely at either of them?
Well, we're starting to get into pretty stratospheric. These are high levels. These are big levers that are being pulled upon by different parties internationally. I just go back to some of the comments I made before, which are, let's not try to have the corporation do things the corporation wasn't designed for. Let's not have unions do things that they weren't designed for. These organizations can partner and collaborate well to achieve outcomes that they've agreed upon. And that actually, to me, is the best way. The partnership that we have with CLAC is a respectful one. We don't try to do CLAC's work. They don't try to do our work as contractors, but we do tremendous things together. And broadening that example, we do tremendous things with owner companies by, again, collaborating with them along the value chain to increase competition, to increase innovation, because that provides the best results. So these trends that are apparently happening, the stakeholder capitalism, are concerning to me because I find that they're distortions. There's these pushes or these impulses to change the nature of what government does or what the corporation does. And I think that anytime you do that, you better watch out, because you're changing the fundamental nature of things that were doing things for decades in a certain way, and now you're doing it a different way. And with change comes a lot of uncertainty. And the last thing I think that many markets need right now is more uncertainty, because for most of them, it's risk management, and you want to lower the level of risk, not increase the amount of risk.
Well, then let's talk about, so again, it's big, high level stuff, but they all seem to be interconnected, because the United Nations leads a lot of the discussion about what should happen with the development of hydrocarbon fuels. And we saw this week, Antonio Guterres saying, that's it, no more exploration and production in fossil fuels. And in fact, I was looking at a story, there are at least 5 jurisdictions that have banned future exploration and production. So Ireland, Spain. I'm sure that there are ones that don't have great skin in the game. So it's very easy to ban production if you don't actually have any. But we know that Canada always seems to want to be the first to demonstrate to the UN that we're on board. And so I'm very uneasy with that report that came out this week. A lot of your members have great paying jobs as a result of the oil sands, and you mentioned LNG production. I've begun to look at the union movement as a great ally for those of us who want to have a sensible approach to balancing the environment and the economy. So I'm glad that you're occupying that space. But you mentioned earlier about how we can convince the world that oil sands is a good investment and how LNG is a good investment. I'll just put one more thing on the table that has me concerned, because France is another one that has banned the exploration and production. And we know that Quebec has a very strong relationship with France, tends to follow a lot of what they do. We've got a prime minister who's from Montreal, and we're on the cusp of a federal election. I gather it's going to be September 20th. And so these are the trends that I worry about. And I guess I'm worried that we're not putting forward a robust enough pushback to it. It's almost like we kind of take for granted that the hydrocarbon business, because it's so valued, so valuable, creates so much profit, as well as so many great jobs, as well as so much revenue for government, that there's no possible way our government would ever go down that path. And yet they're being asked to. So I wonder what the counter argument is to that. How do we use our friends among CLAC and the building trades to make the argument that oil sands is a worthwhile investment? It should be here for a long run. It is a good business. Tell me what your best arguments are there.
Well, I'll make sure that I start my remarks with a reminder. I'm a construction guy, and so I'm not a statesman, a politician who lives in that strata. But starting as a construction person, our companies build things. We'll build anything you give them. We'll build renewable energy facilities. We'll build traditional oil and gas facilities. But if we envision a future where oil and gas industry are kind of uniformly quashed because of government policies, which we do see, whether it's pipelines or facilities, as you mentioned, there's this move afoot to kind of create a sunset for this industry. And I think it's a mistake for two reasons. One is that it is incredibly short-sighted of our political leaders to think that because we have or are going to stop doing this activity, that it's not going to help it happen elsewhere. In fact, it's actually a worse outcome, because, speaking rather generically, other folks are going to do this. Other jurisdictions, whether it's countries or companies, are going to do this in jurisdictions that don't have the same level of environmental fitness, attention to social considerations and governance that we do. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean that we're perfect, but Canada is a world leader in these areas. We have a robust union movement here, much more so than perhaps in the States. We have a robust environmental movement. We have Indigenous groups who are taking equity positions in these oil and gas projects. And instead, we envision a future where other jurisdictions who don't either care or haven't come to care about these issues as much as we do are going to deliver these energy molecules. That doesn't make sense to me. Again, as a construction person who wants to build this stuff, we should build it because we'll do it right. I think the related thing that to comment on there is, I think that the folks who are pursuing this path of total divestment in the oil and gas sector are actually getting it exactly the opposite or reverse. They should be calling for more investment into this industry. And as they may laugh off of their chair when they hear this, but think about how innovation works. These oil and gas companies have innovated for years. And when they're compelled, either because of the prevailing marketplace, the pressures that are upon them to demonstrate fitness, or even government regulation, they always move ahead of the pace. Whether that's the tailings industry or carbon sequestration, you name the example, the owners will always innovate ahead of the game. And so what we should be doing is we should be facilitating innovation across the spectrum. Renewables, sure, let's innovate on that. Let's get better wind, better solar. Let's get into the hydrogen industry. We can talk about that. But let's innovate the living daylights out of oil and gas so that we can demonstrate internationally that what we were before, which was world leaders, is even more so the case 5 or 10 years from now than it was. And in so doing, provide valuable energy molecules to nations in the world who are desperately seeking to be raised out of poverty. We have a nascent LNG sector that's trying to launch in British Columbia. We've got tons of natural gas, clean burning natural gas. We've got now proven projects like LNG Canada and a few others that are trying to demonstrate to the world that we can move these molecules around safely. And it's going to be to the betterment of the world because this is cleaner burning energy. We should light this thing up. Canada should be strategically focusing on all these areas, not just picking winners and losers, because it's not going to benefit workers. It's not going to benefit communities. And this kind of vision that they're going to suddenly find jobs in other sectors, I find that illusory. I find it to be an empty promise, and one not very compelling to the workers that I know who cut their teeth in this oil and gas industry.
I love the way you framed that. I know that you've looked at this just transition consultation. I don't know how deeply you've been able to look into it, but the thing that makes me uneasy, and for those who haven't heard me speak about it before, on July the 20th, Seamus O'Regan, the Natural Resources Minister, launched a consultation talking about what a just transition might look like for energy workers. And the concern I have about that language is Vitor Marciano wrote a column in The Sun pointing out that that's the language that the extreme left uses to talk about completely phasing out fossil fuel use and transitioning energy workers into something entirely different. And so I don't know how seriously we should take this move to do this consultation. I don't know how concerned we should be that the language that is being used there is the same language of the extreme left, and and that's why I'm uncertain. I don't know if this is just a game of politics where they're just trying to win an election, or if there is some strategy of completely phasing out fossil fuels in Canada. I don't know how you're perceiving that, or if you're going to participate in that process. But I like your vision a lot better. That let's transform the energy sector, make it as innovative as possible, so that we can continue to have jobs across the spectrum, including in wind and solar, but not exclusively. So how are you guys approaching that just transition?
Well, we're still taking a look at that document. We will be making a written submission. I don't know how successful that undertaking will be. I have this gut feeling as an individual, not necessarily a PCA as an organization, that the cake is being kind of pre-baked here. There's a definite sort of an ideology at play in the federal government to kind of do this irrespective of what the market wants. And I don't quite know how to stop that, except that we as individuals and folks working in associations and corporations should try to get a different message across. You mentioned the word or highlighted the word transition. I think there's a move afoot, not just in Canada, but in many jurisdictions in the world, to rip down what we have and to kind of have a revolution, whether that's on a social level or an economic, occupational level, whatever the case may be. This kind of thought process is, well, what we have right now is not that good, so we should rip it down and replace it with something else. I think that's an incredibly naive and thoughtless model. Let me use the analogy of what I've talked about earlier in our conversation, this partnership we have with CLAC. The old model was unions are bad, or if you're on the other side of the equation, employers are bad, and then never the twain shall meet. It's a battleground, and you can't improve upon that. So the old approach was to fight. Our approach was to say, let's actually work together, and instead of ripping apart and opposing the unions and driving them into the sea, let's embrace the unions, but let's have accountability across the aisle. Let's make sure that we are talking to each other. When we have problems, we don't let them turn into like nuclear options, but we say it's part of life to have grievances and to have collective bargaining impasses, but we will get through this together, and tomorrow what we've built will be better than what we had yesterday. That's the same thing, I think, on a national or international scale, that we have obvious indications of progress, whether it's political progress or educational or any part of society. Not perfect. Tremendous number of examples can be given to show how things have been done in ways that weren't preferred. But this sort of steady example of improvement, of betterment, of an evolution towards something better can be given in every single example, including in our construction industry. Look at what we've done. An industry that was polarized and unproductive 20 years ago is now vibrant and strong in a way that frankly, I have not seen in any other international jurisdiction. When I meet with, or my team members and I meet with political leaders and bureaucrats and owners of large construction companies, we sometimes do that with our labor partner, CLAC. And we say to them, have you ever had union and management be with you together? And they, to an example, say, well, no, this is completely outside of our realm of experience. This is so refreshing. And that's just an analog to what we can do. If we work together, and this is, I think, fairly simple, as collaborating parties, partnering together, workers with management, management with owners, owners with suppliers, and with government, we can achieve much better things than just say, well, we should just rip it down and have a so-called just transition, which leads to complete uncertainty.
I love what you're saying. Do you have any insight about, you mentioned you want to talk a bit about hydrogen, and I do. Do you have any member companies that are working on any carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects? There are a number of different construction elements to that. The facility to be able to capture, the pipeline to be able to transport, the ability to inject it underground or build new facilities that can utilize it. Is there any insight you can share with us on that, about any progress being made?
Yeah, so our companies, as I mentioned before, our companies build everything. I think the only sector that our companies are not heavily involved in across the country is in the residential sector. But outside of that, institutional, heavy industrial, maintenance, pipelines, you name it, we build it. And so in some ways, we're kind of agnostic about that. We'll build traditional oil and gas, we'll build wind farms and solar farms, and our companies are building carbon sequestration and hydrogen facilities. Going back to the innovation theme that I've stressed repeatedly, I think there's something fascinating, again, going back to leaning into innovation, is that the hydrogen sector is an example where there's a strange confluence of the policies of the federal government and provincial governments to maybe migrate away, either partially or fully, from the oil and gas sector into more clean burning technologies like hydrogen. And the fact that many of the companies who are in that sector already are familiar with oil and gas. And so the more that you innovate across that spectrum, you're actually going to get better results to the oft-held pursuit of net zero. I've often thought, perhaps privately, that it may be the oil and gas companies who beat the renewable companies to net zero over the next 20 or 30 years because of that impulse to innovate, because that's now being supported in public policy and investment pathways. You look at the hydrogen sector, I think that some of the idealists would prefer to have pure green hydrogen and want to stay away from gray hydrogen, but the blue hydrogen sector might be this sort of middle road where the goals of many disparate groups are met. And in the meantime, our contractors will be delighted to build all that infrastructure to make Canada stronger.
I love what you're saying. In fact, we're doing a hydrogen segment, I think, next week. And I would rather us talk about net zero hydrogen. And so it doesn't matter whether it comes from wind and solar through or nuclear through an electrolysis process, or whether it comes from methane and natural gas, and then we're doing carbon capture. It strikes me, if you can capture the emissions and do something with them, whether put it to useful purposes because you're creating new products or you're putting it back underground, if it's not going up in the atmosphere, it should be immaterial, whether it's blue or whether it's green. So thanks for that context. Let's then talk about this other big problem that we have is, do you have enough workers? So this is why this just transition is so important as a consultation, because if we're going to have overlying government policy that predisposes or predetermines what the outcome is, it's going to have a huge impact for the number of kids we're going to be able to attract into certain types of professions. And I think that the skilled trades, the skilled professions, we're going to need a huge number of workers taking an interest in that area for a long time to come. And I want to get a sense of where you see we are at, where the deficiencies are, where some of the bottlenecks are in recruitment. I've talked to a number of our members who are suggesting to me that within 3 years, we're going to face a skilled trades crunch. Maybe we're already seeing it in some of the trades that your member companies need. But why don't you tell us what the landscape looks like?
Yeah, we for some time now have had a rather strange, kind of slow burning perfect storm kind of boiling up underneath our very nose in our industry, not just construction, but in perhaps other industries, but in construction particularly. I sit on the board of BuildForce, which is a large information gathering, labor market information gathering organization, which is constituted of all the different sector stakeholders. And we have found through our statistics that over the next 5 to 10 years, the construction industry is going to lose about 200 to 250,000 workers. So if you got about 1.3 million field workers in the industry and you're going to lose 250,000, that is an unbelievable loss of talent. At the same time, and partly contributing to that phenomenon, is an aging population of construction workers. So the average age of the Canadian tradesperson is alarmingly high. It's in the mid to late 50s. And so we have an obvious problem of a gap, a delta of enough workers. We have an aging population. We have youth who are being, for a variety of reasons, informed or led to believe that the construction industry is not a good destination for them. The industry itself has perhaps, at least in previous times, not done as good as it could to demonstrate that the industry is welcoming to anybody and everybody who wants to work into it. A lot of those things are improving. In the last number of years, organizations like Women Building Futures, with whom we partner, have done an amazing job, and they're just one organization, one notable organization, who are bringing construction skilled trade opportunities to women in a way that hasn't been done before. Typically in Canada, by way of example, I believe the percentage of women as a function of construction employees is around, I think, 3 to 5% maximum. In our industry in Alberta, it's as high as 7 or 8%. Now that's not great. There's a lot of work to be done, but without any kind of government compulsion, our industry has said, we need more people. We need, to open ourselves up to underutilized segments of the population. Let's have more women working, and the experience has been phenomenal. Typically, women are better equipment operators than men, who tend to be.
Can I tell you what I hear? I hear that women are not as hard on the equipment.
That's right. And there's it's not just opening opportunities for women. Indigenous peoples for years have been welcomed into our industry. That's still a challenge that we have to work on. But working on all those fronts, whether it's women, Indigenous, or youth, there's a lot of change happening in our industry. But we have to work, as I mentioned before, together on this, because if the educational institutions are not in sync with the needs that we are seeing in our industry, we're going to have this problem. Because, again, not to speak too generally, if we have a career counselor in a high school tell a young man or woman in grade 11 or 12 that they should go to university instead of trade school, they're creating a false kind of a binary choice. Where what we've seen in other jurisdictions like Germany is that many youth will get a trades certificate or some kind of professional skill, and then they will graduate from high school with that in their pocket and either go on to work in that trade or use that as a springboard to some other professional capacity, staying in my industry, supervision, estimating, or engineering. We need to think that way. We need to think, instead of having these kind of either or things, it's both and. We can teach these skills to our young people as legacy capabilities that they can use throughout their lives. It can be a part of their career for a period of time, and it might be a career for their whole life. Very good paying career, very affirming career, or it could be a springboard to something else. So we've got to fix that linkage with the school system.
How do you think we should? Do you mind if I ask you how we should go about doing that? Because I've identified that problem as well. In fact, I spoke with the head of CLAC. It's Wayne Prinz, isn't it? The head of CLAC. I was speaking with him, and I was seeing if he'd be interested in helping out on being on the board or whatever of a charter trade school. He said, well, it's not the right answer. I said, what do you mean it's not the right answer? He said, we need this in every high school. We need every high school to have an approach where a large number of the students are getting some of the foundational skills that they need and then graduating, exactly as you say, with either a trade certificate that allows them to get started, or the first year of a program that allows them to go on to the next one. And I tend to agree that this, a charter school for me is kind of a way of making the point that these jobs are on par in future opportunity, in prestige and esteem as any other track. But I don't know how you get that transformation within the education system without trying to go outside. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that, but I think it's vitally important.
I won't pick a winner or loser in the debate between a widespread approach or a charter school. I think that what has to happen is a shift of mindset in the educational system, and it's not at high school level. It's part of that, but it's at grade school level, because that's where some of the early seeds are being planted about what occupational opportunities are out there. And it goes to another major theme, which sounds a little highfalutin, but it's called parity of esteem. Mm-hmm. The idea that a tradesperson is as valuable and meaningful to society as an occupation as a doctor or a lawyer. In Germany, for example, that is very much the case. The tradespeople, perhaps going back to centuries-old guilds that they actually have a certain way of dressing if you're a pipe fitter or a mason or an electrician. And they are celebrated. After they receive their trade certificate, they actually kind of go on a kind of a walkabout, so to speak, for a year, and they work kind of itinerantly. And they get tremendous opportunity because people want that work to be done. They need that work to be done. And they appreciate it being done by a quality tradesperson. Mm-hmm. And so the parity of esteem completely changes the equation when you go back to the example of grade school or high school, because there's no longer a kind of a binary choice of your first option is to go to university. And if you're not really cut for it, you can take the default, the backup, which is a trade. That's not how they cook that cake in Germany. They say, well, no, these are both equally legitimate pathways. And so there's a societal issue about holding high the trades that people use, not just with their hands, because many tradespeople also have to use their brains. Increasingly, instrumentation electricians are very sophisticated in the work that they do, and all tradespeople are. So I think it's an educational thing. I think it's a society, way that we interpret society. And I think it's just, I go back to competition. I think if we have more competition, maybe the charter school is one way to say, hey, we're offering an alternative to the norm here to create some dynamic choices in society. I kind of support that in principle. I think that having one size fits all tends to take options off the table. And we need more options right now for young people.
Well, you live it, and that maybe is the reason why we do need to have a few different models, and then something will emerge. The maybe, it's interesting, you kind of planted a seed with me there as well. If we've got 20% of our skilled trades workforce retiring in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe there should be a push on to try to get them to consider a second career as guidance counselors in all of our junior highs and high schools. Maybe, because this is part of it, is that I think that when we've created a system where if you are a teacher, it's because you went to university and got your education and you ended up with a really great job. And so your context is, I got to go to university to get a really great job. We need folks who have had really great careers from a different type of environment, a different training path, to be able to be the model for those kids. And I wonder if there's something there about how we can get that baked into the system across the board without kind of disrupting the entire education model of trying to change the way education institutes work. I'm just sort of blue skying right now.
Yeah, and I'll carefully comment on that, because I don't want to take away from the appropriateness of teachers having the appropriate credentials, a bachelor of education, whatever the case may be. That's obviously important. But the trap there, again, in our kind of relatively binary system, is that overwhelmingly the teachers that teach in our grade schools and high schools will have pursued that academic track for themselves to the exclusion of a trades track. And so when they become teachers, they may intellectually understand, if they're particularly broad-minded, the benefit of a trade, but they may not have experienced it. Whereas I would think it would be much better to carefully unpack the credential requirements of a teacher in an Alberta grade school or high school, so that a former tradesperson who's now retired or nearing retirement can become a teacher or an instructor in a traditional elementary or high school environment, but not have to be forced to go back to university and get an educational a bachelor's in education. Again, these are complicated areas. I'm not trying to skate past them.
I'm so glad you mentioned it, though, because I remember
how
talking
powerful
about
would it be to have a teacher in high school who used to be a tradesperson saying, "Here's shop class," or whatever the case may be, and I'm gonna demythologize this for you.
It's totally true, and it's the and I remember talking with the merit contractors years ago, Bill Stewart, and he mentioned the same thing, because a lot of tradesmen and women would have had the experience of
Yeah.
educating young people all the way through because they're apprentices. So there seems to be a natural alliance there of those
Yeah.
who've had a career in whatever skilled profession, that it should be there, with not too much teacher education training, they should be able
Yeah.
to do both. So I'm totally in agreement with you
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Can I so tell me where the trouble is, because I'll tell you another issue that I've heard, because I've talked to some teachers who are in the trades in the current public education system, and one of the complexities that we face is with our funding model, where we fund students on a per student basis. Here's the problem: 30 kids in a physics class attracts a certain amount of dollars. Whereas if you have a shop class, maybe safely you can only have 15 kids in that class. Shop requires expensive equipment, it requires expensive space, and you have fewer students, so it's costing more. So what it was put to me is that's part of the reason why we started phasing out trades education in our schools across the entire province. So how do you reverse that? I don't know if you've done some thinking around how we actually build the capacity for the training, because I'll tell you how I think it plays out. If the schools don't do this in K to 12, then it's going to be up to those who are in the business of setting up your own training institutes and just training independently. And I think the independent contractors do that. But there's also unions that will do it also if they can't get the trades taught either in the high schools or at SAIT or NAIT. Then they're going to set up their own shops. And then I guess we kind of get back into this binary argument again. Well, if you got trained through a building trade, then the only way jobs that are going to be available are going to be building trade sites. So I'm trying to understand where this goes if we don't take a proactive measure to all agree, sort of like you did before, where you said, we'll have to agree. Let's get the investment here. Let's get the jobs, and then we can figure out how to parse it out afterwards. Let's all agree that we've got to get more kids in this pipeline, and then we can figure out whether they're going to go building trades or CLAC or independent merit on their own. But how do we get that first stepping stone? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, I think it begins with political will. I think that the provincial and or municipal government has to have a dedicated purpose when it comes to their funding of educational institutions and the outcomes that they want to have. And I think that has to be translated into the institutions themselves, because the scenario you described is what I would call a doom loop. The fewer students in class, the less funding, and the funding turns into garbage equipment, and so nobody wants to do it. Now, I don't know if this is possible, but just on my feet, I draw an analogy from my own life. I went to university in a liberal arts context, and so I took subject matter that was not necessarily part of my main track, but that was done because in the liberal arts format, the idea is to create a broad-based kind of a foundation for future personal and occupational life. Maybe that needs to be done in high schools too. Even though an individual may not be destined for a trade, expose them to it. It's not going to hurt them. So have that part of, I'm not going to use the word required, but bake that into the educational system by a measure of political will to say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to expose all these children to these different things. We're going to ensure that they have the tools in terms of demythologizing what construction means or different trades are, so that if they come to a point of decision, they've got the widest set of options possible, rather than kind of pre-deciding that for them and saying, well, no, you're probably going to go into the tech industry, so let's just focus on that. Well, that's an incredibly presumptive thing to do on behalf of society.
We just had a major curriculum review, but I think I would have heard if mandatory trades exposure was part of the new curriculum. I don't think it is it?
Well, I'm not even saying mandatory. I'm just saying, like, find a better way to include this in the suite of things young people are exposed to. Because again, you're going back to your impulse to create a charter school. We used to have vocational schools,
Mm-hmm.
and what happened to them?
You know what it is that they got treated like last chance high. And so what happened is, again, they went for the easy types of trades where
Yeah.
it was electrician and carpentry and hair salons and beauticians. And that isn't the full range of options that are available to young people. And I think that the difference that I noticed in the skills for jobs task force is, if you look at the European model, there is a pathway to attract to go to, I think, over 300 different trades professions coordinated through the schools that provide those experiences. And that's the kind of direction that we should go. We talk about 18 building trades, but
Yeah.
in the universe of jobs and careers that you can have, it's far more than that. So I think
Mhm.
I know that the premier is when you talk about political will, as I was going through and doing my consulting around what needs to be done on this, I kept on meeting people saying, yeah, the premier, when he was in his former job, he took a bunch of people over to Europe, and they did a tour around the UK and
Mhm.
Germany, and I think one
Yeah,
other
I was on that
location.
trip.
You were on that trip.
It was
So,
fantastic.
well, there you go. So why don't you tell that story? Because I'm telling it secondhand. It's just every person I talked to said, oh yeah, I went on that trip. So I think we've got the political will with the premier. I think he's driving it through the advanced education minister, Dimitris Nicolaitis.
Mhm.
And maybe we'll start seeing something over the next year or so. But I just need to understand what that trip was all about, and what your takeaways from it were.
Yeah, I won't try to characterize Jason Kenney's motivation perfectly when he was HRSDC minister, but the invitation went out to a broad group of stakeholders. We're building trades and CLAC and PCA and Merit and a whole hodgepodge of different organizations. It was a fantastic group, a mission that went to Germany and the UK. And the fundamental purpose of the effort was to learn from those two jurisdictions as kind of standout jurisdictions internationally, who have these amazingly effective trades training institutions and capabilities. And we learned a number of key lessons. Number one was a lesson that I struggled to put my finger on, because we went to meeting after meeting of different chambers of commerce, and there were unions involved, and German business organizations, different levels of government. And at one point I put up my hand in this big, huge forum, and I said, how do you guys do this so well? On paper, you guys should be fighting all the time, because you're competing stakeholders and your unions and businesses. And the guy just kind of shrugged, and he said, we just do it. We said, we all believe in the same thing. We may have different ways of getting there, but we are determined to make Germany stronger because of this. So there was one element which maybe scares some people because it sounds like nationalism, but it's not, is nation building, is the fundamental commitment. We heard this over and over again, whether it was business owners from Stihl, the chainsaw company, to government leaders, to actual workers that we interviewed, is they want to make their country stronger. In Canada, we kind of do it the other way around. The first thing is the individual, then it's the company, and then it's the country. And I'm not going to say whether one model is right or wrong, because I am a firm believer in individual, impulses and motivations. But that nation building thing was very compelling. And
you know what, we've had it before too. When we talk about our Olympics team, we talk about owning the podium. So this is kind of owning the podium in a different way. I get that. Continue.
So the second lesson is one I mentioned earlier, which is the parity of esteem. We quickly discovered, particularly in Germany, how celebrated tradespeople are, and that through that celebration comes a bunch of magical things. One of them is loyalty. These young people would be apprenticed or indentured at a particular place of work, and they would just be so grateful to that company for giving them a job while they were in high school, that the logical thing was, I'm going to work for this place for the rest of my life, or for much of my life. And that kind of stickiness is so powerful, to have that kind of loyalty. And that loyalty can also be attached to a union, that helped you with that training. That's fine. But that sort of gratitude, and whereas in Canada, we tend to have this sort of fear constantly, which is borne out by experience of workers just moving from company to company based on small, package changes in remuneration. Nothing wrong with that either. But the idea in Germany was loyalty, of appreciation for somebody that trained you. Another example or lesson that we learned was early commencement, that in grade school already, and this is a very controversial thing for us in Canada, that young people were, I'm not sure how they were done this, what device was used to discover these things, but the aptitude of different students in grade school were discovered to be university track or trade school track. And again, with the caveat, which is the third, fourth lesson, of parity of esteem. So if an individual was kind of pre-tracked in elementary school to begin to get into the trades by the time they were done elementary school and entering high school, they weren't treated as they were on plan B. They were all on plan A. They were just on a plan that was commensurate with their way of, working in the world.
That makes so much sense.
And
It's funny. Go ahead.
Celebrated, and they graduated high school with a trade certificate. In Canada, it might be 21 or even later that a person may get their trade certificate. And think about what happens in terms of your economic progress as a young person. You spend the first couple of years after high school in Canada trying to figure out what's going to happen to you. Am I going to go to university? Am I going to work in a skilled trade? What am I going to do? In Germany, all options are on the table. You graduated with a skill. You can either do that for a while or forever, or you can migrate into university, become an engineer. And going back to my earlier example, you can be an engineer that's informed by construction reality. And so you actually have a better engineer because that person is rooted in experience.
Oh,
so the
totally.
German model had almost countless numbers of examples that just, frankly, we were kind of gobsmacked. The whole time we were just kind of, obviously the pace of meetings was rather breathless, but the mental flow of concepts was just nonstop all the way through.
Well, every time I've talked to the premier about this, he gets very excited about it. So I think there's the political will there. Now it's sort of a matter of connecting it with a system that has a different, when you talk about things being baked in, it's sort of got a different approach, which is gearing kids towards university. Even though when I was on the school board in 98, I think only 30% of kids go on to university, which means 70% are going to go on and do something else. And why do we have to wait 5 or 10 years before they find a meaningful career track in a skilled profession? There's got to be a better way of connecting them earlier along the track.
And that's fascinating, because I think that, again, being a little bit generalizing a little bit, I think that the obvious problem that occurred to educators was, we've got to get more kids into university. 30%, that's terrible. We've got to make that number higher, without perhaps stopping to think university is only one path. There's other equally legitimate and worthwhile paths. In some ways, actually more economically, like a tradesperson nowadays in Canada can make much, much more than the average university grad. And it's work that is absolutely personally motivating. Let me give you an example. I was at a golf tournament with Careers Next Generation about a month ago in Calgary. And Careers Next Generation is an organization that people should check out. They help youth get exposed to the trades. On a couple of the golf holes were young people, 18, 19 years old, some of them are still in high school or just graduated from high school, who were, to my German example, in the middle of their apprenticeship already. The stories that these kids told when we briefly stopped at these golf holes were just amazing. Like a young woman who was a millwright, second-year millwright, so proud of the work she was doing, so eager for what would lay ahead for her. She knew that she had job opportunities, because skilled trades, to our earlier point, are in high demand. So she knew that she was going to be able to earn for herself. She was already at a young age earning much more than her peers. Not that it's all about economics, but the satisfaction that these kids had in the work that they did was just compelling. And so going back to that theme, not jumping too much around here, I think another element that we have to tackle in Canada is, it goes to the parity of esteem thing, but it also means celebrating the individuals who do this. And these kids, to me, are champions. And we should have these people in parades. They should be in high schools. They should be at the events like I went to infect people with this kind of powerful motivation that my kid should be one of these. Because I can picture my kid being like this one here, being a millwright or a plumber or a pipe fitter or electrician. Because these kids they were not sort of saying, well, I didn't really know what to do with my life, so I picked this trade. They were like, no. I looked around, I talked to some people, I took some internships, I did some studying on this, and I figured I want to be a millwright. And they were so pumped about that. It was really infectious.
Okay, so we've got to get them being peer mentors in all of the junior highs and high
Right,
schools as well.
right.
Okay, we could talk for another hour, I'm sure, but maybe you should give me an idea of who I need to talk to next, because I think I've made a note for Careers Next Generation,
Yeah.
because I think we need to understand a little bit more about the work that they do. One thing that I feel I have a missing piece on is I don't know where to go to know that we're going to have a shortage of millwrights, therefore we need to have more millwrights, or we're going to have a shortage of crane operators, therefore we're going to need more
Yeah.
crane operators. And if I don't know where to find that information, I guarantee a junior high school kid doesn't know where to find that information either. So who has that information? How do we know who's retiring from what professions, what the need's going to be, what the projections are? Is there some central
Well,
depository of that info?
the Build Force organization I mentioned has data on all the different trades in Canada, broken down by province and by sector. And it shows a kind of a heat map, if you will, of which trades are in high demand and which are in low demand. And I'm not faulting Build Force for this, but an obvious remark to make here is that this data should be given to the high schools and to the guidance counselors and to the education sector, to say there's a tremendous number of occupational opportunities here. Expose this to young people and let them know where they are. Because one of the problems I criticize the university for, even as a university grad, and I think it's fantastic to get a university degree, is there should be some kind of feedback mechanism for young entrants, whether in their freshman or sophomore year, to say, here's a track that actually has some traction in the marketplace. I'll just use an unfair example, but I can use it on myself because I graduated with a psychology and social work major and minor. Should I get a social work degree if there's not a lot of jobs in it? Should I be told about that at some juncture, or should I get a degree and find out about that later on? That's not to disparage the profession. It's simply to be realistic and say, where are the actual opportunities? And I think that should be done for university kids, somewhere at the beginning of that pathway, and it should be done for high school kids as they contemplate going into a trade. Because to your point, who knows this information? Those connections need to be made better.
Okay, you've given me a new lobbying priority. I have such a long list, but this one is so vitally important as well. So I'm adding it to my list. I'll do my work on trying to get around all the high schools. Thank you so much for your time today. I'll probably follow up with you on a few of these items.
Sure.
I know we brainstormed a lot of topics to talk about. Is there any big piece that I missed that you want to make sure that people know about, what the kind of work that you're doing, the kind of priorities you have, before I let you go?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I think that the marketplace needs to know that the construction industry is not just innovative on the kind of the hard side of, different materials and equipment and that kind of thing. That's the obvious part of innovation in the construction industry. What people need to pay attention in is the innovation on the soft side, the different arrangements of how workers are represented in the workplace, again, along that spectrum, how employers are able to leverage those opportunities to create value for owners, for project owners, and how the investment community should be looking at this industry as an unbelievably vibrant place because of those changes that have been made. A great destination for their investment monies. And because our contractors are always willing to work on these issues of environment and social and governance, we are the key partners for government, both at the federal and provincial level, when they want to unpack these things and do it better. Because contractors, we're ready to go. We're pragmatic, but we're thoughtful. And so all we need is a task, and we'll lean into it. So I appreciate the opportunity to walk through some of these things with you, Danielle. And if there's more conversation to be had in the future, I welcome that.
I'm sure they are. I'm going to plant a seed with you. It sure would be nice to see your model applied to public sector jobs and service delivery. Wouldn't it be interesting to see how different the environment for healthcare would be, or the environment for education would be, or social work, if you could actually have the sort of the merit type of contractor, the CLAC type of contractor, and the traditional union contractor all operating in the same space? I don't know if you're going to expand that area.
Well, that's another 2-hour conversation, but that competition and innovation is missing in some of those sectors, and it's to all of our collective disadvantage, because it costs more when you have a lack of competition, and when you quash or take the oxygen out of the room when it comes to innovation. you just don't get as good outcomes. There should be options for people in the marketplace, and the more we can do to enhance and increase those, the better it is for all of us.
I do have one person asking how you get along with Gil McGowan, because I kind of think of him as the lead spokesperson on that public sector side. And I can, have you ever had a conversation with him about what we just mentioned there?
No, not on that score. We have been in some panels together, and suffice it to say, we don't have the same perspective on things. Not to elongate the conversation, I have respect for these folks. They are doing their earnest best to represent the union members that they represent. We work with CLAC, who has the same mandate. They just have a different ideology, a different philosophy, and that's where my path diverges. I think that many of the older, so to speak, traditional unions have lost their way when it comes to the understanding of what it means to have a robust, strong workplace. And the idea of attaching adversarial relationships to that as a presumption is so undermining and so unproductive that, to me, the industry is begging to see what we are doing, which is attach collaboration, attach partnership, attach problem solving. Even within the context of these different obligations and responsibilities that the union and the contractor might have, we can work together. We can work together with government. We can work together with owners and with investors and make the industry stronger. So yeah, I've had some experience with some of these folks. We've had some healthy debates, and they will continue until more competition causes them to change their perspective.
Music to my ears. You're such a great advocate for your contractors. Thanks so much for spending so much time with us today. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you very much as well.
You got it. That is Paul DeYoung. He is the president of the Progressive Contractors Association. And I've known Paul, as I said, I think I probably first got introduced to him when I was wearing my media hat with the Calgary Herald. And it's been remarkable to me to watch over the years how things have transformed. And to me, that is what it's all about. It's about competition. And if we can get that kind of model operating in more environments, it creates that nice, healthy tension where everybody is working to improve not only the workplace conditions, but also improve performance and also be more productive. So excellent conversation. Hope you enjoyed it. We got to do a little bit more work on trying to connect the kids who I think could have incredible careers in skilled professions with the opportunities that are out there. So I got my marching orders. We're out of time for this week. We will be talking hydrogen next week. And I look forward to you tuning in then. I'm Danielle Smith, president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. Thanks again.